Welcome to our program entitled How Banning Books Undermines Democracy. I'm Sharon Hirsch, the Program Vice President of the Collin County League of Women Voters. League of Women Voters Texas defines program as the education and advocacy platform adopted by members to empower voters and defend democracy. At our annual meeting in May, our members voted to focus on the Making Democracy Work campaign of the LWV-US as this year's program. Along with all the important work we do in voter services, we have developed a series of educational events to address topics of interest to our community and our members, and to connect those issues to our impact on our democracy. Please sign up for our League newsletter, or better yet, join our organization at lwvcollin.org to receive updates on our plans. Today's program coincides with the American Library Association's Banned Books Week 2022, celebrating the freedom to read. We are recording this event and will be making it available on our website in its entirety. We are honored to have three distinguished panelists here to answer our questions and share their thoughts and experiences with us. Let's meet our guests. Carolyn Foote is a retired and rewired 29-year Texas school librarian who works on issues of intellectual freedom, as well as advising on library design. Recently, Carolyn was awarded the American Library Association's Robert Downs Intellectual Freedom Award and the American Association of School Librarians Intellectual Freedom Award. She is one of the co-founders of the grassroots group FReadom, that's FReadom Fighters. We welcome Carolyn.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Next, we have Christina Gola. Christina is Associate Dean for Organizational Development, Learning, and Talent at the University of Houston Libraries, where she leads organizational effectiveness, human resources, employee development, recruitment, and onboarding, with a focus on building equity and inclusion into the organization. She began her career as an academic librarian, teaching information literacy skills, and published and presented on student learning and assessment. Today, her scholarship focuses on library leadership and leading change. Christina serves as an advocate for libraries across state and national associations, having served as president of the Texas Library Association in 2020, 2021, and as a fellow in the Association of Research Libraries in 2018 and 2019. She won the award for Outstanding Alumni from the University of North Texas Department of Information Science in 2021. Thanks for being here, Christina.
Thanks, I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Spencer Smith. Spencer is currently the Director of Libraries for the City of McKinney. He has been a library director for over 10 years. Prior to his role in McKinney, he has worked for the City of Haltom City, the City of Fort Worth, the Town of Little Elm, and as a CIO for a venture capital firm based in Las Colinas. He currently lives in Flower Mound, Texas, with his wife of 17 years and his three children, ages 15, 11, and 11. We appreciate your participation, Spencer.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our discussion, so let's get started. Audience members had an opportunity to submit questions during registration. You can also use the Q&A function of the webinar to submit additional questions during the program. We will screen those for inclusion if time permits. So our first question is, can you describe the process you go through when curating a library collection? What are the collection and review processes and who is involved? And we're going to start with Carolyn.
Good evening, everyone. So, as you mentioned, I was a school librarian, and so there are typical processes for schools that are a little different from public and academic libraries. In school libraries, districts have a school board approved selection policies, which outline criteria for selecting materials for the library. These criteria are fairly general, but they ask librarians to include a wide variety of viewpoints, materials for a wide range of maturity levels and ages, to include controversial issues, to include a wide range of cultures. And those are some of the typical criteria that you have in the policy. And then librarians select materials through training that we've had using research journals that are specific to librarians, where reviews are written about new books coming out. And then we also use award lists. People don't really think about this, but most award lists like the Caldecott Award or the Newbery Award, those books are actually curated by a lot of librarians who read hundreds of books in order to narrow it down to the finalists and the actual winners. So those books have also been highly vetted. And then school librarians also do accept student recommendations and teacher recommendations. While we look at reviews for those materials, we welcome the input of our students and teachers and administrators.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Next is Christina.
Okay, so one thing that I would want to start with is to emphasize a fact that a lot of people are not aware of when they look at who's working in libraries and who has authority to be creating the collection development policies that Carolyn mentioned. Librarians are professionals. We are considered in a professional or discipline, and we have master's degrees, and we go through training to think about critically what would go into a collection development policy and how to work with our governing authorities, whatever it may be, whether it's a school board or a city, or in the case of academic libraries, our provost and our faculty boards. And our professional training prepares us to develop collections and collection development policies. And we also go through extensive ongoing education. Most of us go to annual conferences and get continuing education credits that are accredited by the American Library Association or whatever affiliate accrediting body our particular type of libraries adhere to. So it's something that it's important to emphasize that we are professionals doing this work. As Carolyn mentioned, in the academic library world, we also have collection development policies, and our collection development policies are built on curricula, the curricula that's being taught across a campus, and or the research that faculty members are doing. We also have many recommendations that come in. We have a lot of what we call on-demand collection development building, because it's based on what students and faculty are exploring in the classroom or what they're researching on. And with these collection development policies, I want to emphasize that librarians are not selecting materials based on personal preferences or beliefs, but rather we are looking at the defined criteria that we've put into our policies. And as Carolyn mentioned too, we do a lot of extensive looking at reviews of the materials. We look at the merit, the quality, and the significance of the materials, the authenticity, and the content of the materials. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. And for many of us too, the things that we collect has to reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve. So it's going to differ depending on the communities you're in or the type of libraries that you're in.
Great, thank you. Next up is Spencer.
We're similar. We have a very robust collection development policy. It's vetted through the Library Advisory Board, who are appointed by council. So we do have, we We answer to people with our policies, like everything. We're a little different in that certain things like maybe the veracity of certain information when you're in a public library setting isn't as important as demand. So if it's a holistic remedy that has negative reviews, but people want it, or a diet book that has, maybe sketchy advice, but people want it, we're really driven by demand. We serve our public. McKinney, we're over 200,000 people, and we try to collect for all that group. And our target goal beyond our policy is our turnover rate. So that's the average number of times that each item in the collection checks out in a given year. And we're number 5 in the state for turnover rate. Allen and Frisco are, Frisco's actually number 1. So Collin County really loves their libraries. They really love their library collections. And we work with third-party analytics software, internal reporting to identify books that are highly likely to check out at that level and meet that demand. And so that's a big driver of what we get. So we added about 25,000 items this last year. We expect all of those to come close to meeting that threshold, depending on it averages out. But about 600 of those were purchase suggestions that we missed, our selectors missed, because they're small presses, small print runs. When you're adding 23,000 things in a year, you're going to miss a few. And we do have a robust purchase suggestion feature as well. And the reason that we reject the ones we reject is usually because they're out of print and we just can't get them, or they're not printed yet. And so we can't get them. And then like a very small percentage of the ones we reject are because they go against that policy. So our policy is pretty broad because our mandate's different. We're here to collect for 200,000 people in a very cosmopolitan area with a variety of different opinions and viewpoints and leisure activities. So for us, I mean, if I was to put it much shorter than I just did, we get what people want. So that's the goal.
Oh, I think that's great. I'm so glad we have professionals that are at all these different levels of library services, so we can get an idea of how those books end up on the shelf. So now that we know how they got there, we want to talk about how you would handle a book challenge and what the formal process is, or is there a formal process, and what does that look like? And we're going to start with Christina.
So most libraries, at least in all the ones that I have worked with through my work in the Texas Library Association, have reconsideration policies of some sort, which establish a clear, transparent process for determining whether a book should be removed from a library or whether there should be some type of limited access put on the material. These, like the collection development policies, these policies or processes are approved by the governing authorities. And the typical process is a patron submits a reconsideration form or whatever process that particular library has, and it's reviewed by a committee or some type of governing body. Typically in this process, the members of that body will read the material and familiarize themselves with it. And then there's some kind of decision that's provided to the patron in writing with justification for what the decision is on whether to retain the book or limit its access in some fashion. If there's usually also some type of additional step in the process, if the patron does not agree with the original decision, they can elevate the concern or complaint to, say, a school board, a library board, or some body above that particular reconsideration committee. So these are pretty standard processes, and they've been in place for many, many years.
Okay, thanks. Spencer, let us know how things go at the McKinney Library.
That's pretty close to exactly what we do. We try to head off the official challenges through conversation before we get there. So they come in and they'll complain to a staff member, and we'll try to figure out, well, what is the actual complaint about? Oftentimes it's that they just feel it's not in the appropriate area of the library, that they think it belongs in the adult section, not the teen section, something like that. And then we'll still take that into consideration, and we'll talk it over with our selectors and compare it with the rest of the collection. We'll also compare with libraries around us to see where they have it. And then we'll get back with them. We have moved things that way. You know, sometimes you order something, believe it or not, selectors don't read every book that comes in the library. We just can't. And sometimes you order something and there's an image in part of it that you didn't catch through your review process, or something that just doesn't mesh with where you thought it should go in the collection. So we have moved items. But if they escalate, usually it'll come to me, and then the staff will ask them if they want to do a formal complaint, and most people don't. Most people really just want to talk to someone. And so then I will talk to them. If they do submit a formal complaint, I'm the arbiter of whether it stays in the collection or not. And that is based on if it fits our collection guidelines. If they don't like my answer, which is usually that it stays in the collection because the selectors know the collection guidelines when they purchase the materials, then we do invite them to come speak to the library board. They are representatives of the community. They're, chosen by council. And so they can make their case in front of the board. And then we listen to the board's advice and take that into account, and we're quiet while they present their case. And so that's the process. Typically, we want to talk to people. Just turning in a piece of paper doesn't get us the information we need, and it doesn't allow us to really understand the problem.
Great, thanks. I think those conversations are always a good thing to have, right? Okay, Carolyn, how about in your experience?
Well, again, the experience in schools is very much what Christina outlined. Schools have a reconsideration process that was approved by each school board. And as part of the selection policy, we of course encourage those conversations, those informal conversations first, because we want to make sure we understand what the concern is and that we aren't getting tripped up over definitions of things and we're not clear with one another what the concern is. And we want to really show care about a parent's own child, and maybe there's some way we can accommodate their concern in a way that just helps and assists their own child. And so that is something, because in Texas, you may not know, all school librarians have a teaching degree and have taught for 2 years. And so we do have that teaching background. And so we do try to find instructional ways to assist a child if there is a concern about a particular material. The other thing I wanted to mention overall is that sometimes people forget that policies actually protect all of us, because we're a very diverse society and people have lots of opinions about different things. Even within a family, you'll find people have many different opinions. That when you have policies that define a process for how to proceed when there is a question about something, then those policies serve as sort of guide rails for everyone. And they protect sort of arbitrary decision-making and changes in leadership, or so on and so forth. And so I think it's just important for everyone to understand, just like in anything else, like a policy for a field trip or a policy for, how cheerleaders are chosen for the cheerleading squad. All of those policies protect everyone to try and make the process as fair as possible for all.
Thank you. I'm so glad you pointed out that emphasis on really good, strong policies and how important that is for organizations to have. Next, I want to ask you, what are some of the more notable books that have been challenged and or banned throughout the years? I'm currently rereading Grapes of Wrath. I think that might have been on the list at some point. And do you have a favorite banned book? And we're going to start with Spencer.
I think the list of books that have been challenged is very long and it's regional. And my favorite for the reasons that it was banned was the Lorax. That's kind of a notable one. I like to use the most anodyne examples of banning to show kind of how it can get taken out of context and out of hand. That was banned because it was in a logging community and they felt that the message of the book was kind of antithetical to what their mill town was about, and that it was trying to turn the children against them. And so usually when you tell someone, yeah, people wanted to ban the Lorax, then they're like, well, oh, and it makes them think a little bit about why they want maybe to move the book that they want to move. And but I mean, the list just, I mean, almost anything that's worth reading, someone doesn't like. So and challenges are easy to do. Banning is harder, but I mean, that's probably my favorite.
Great. And I'm glad you did distinguish between challenging books and then actually having them removed from the shelf. That's really important. Okay, Carolyn, what's your favorite and what are some of the more notable books?
So one of my favorites, this is kind of a throwback, but to childhood is, and this book was actually challenged, not banned, was Sylvester and the Magic Pebble, which is a children's picture book about a donkey named Sylvester. And I won't spoil the plot, but it was challenged because of the different animals that were chosen to depict different professions in the book. So books can be challenged for any reason whatsoever, but I have a lot of fond memories of that book. Some more notable books that have been challenged that are kind of interesting historically. One of them is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which actually, when the book came out in the 1800s, was considered rather shocking because the character of Huckleberry Finn was not considered a model boy. So it's very different from reasons today that people might be challenging the book. You know, Huck wore shorts and he swore and he ran away from home, and he did not provide what people thought at the time that literature should provide, a model example of what a character's like, not reflect maybe real life characters. And so it was actually burned in some places. So it was considered quite the controversy, but it was simply because of the character, primarily because of the character of Huckleberry Finn.
Thanks. Christina, you want to share your favorites or more notable books?
Sure. I won't take too long on this one, but I think it's interesting that I tend to lean towards the classics that have been banned or challenged over the years. It's most of the books that I read in high school and college. Huck Finn, Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men. I do think it's interesting that one of the ones that was banned in the 80s is 1984 because it was considered pro-communist. And when you think about the times in which books or the time period in which some of the books were either challenged or banned, it really reflects what was going on in society at that time. So the same example with Carolyn related to Huck Finn not being a model boy. Grapes of Wrath had vulgar words and was banned because of that. And Animal Farm in 1963 is one of my other favorite examples because masses were afraid that masses would revolt because of the content of the book. So it very much is a reflection, I think, of what society is grappling with at the time.
Oh, thank you. Those are really great examples. And I think I had a question later on about historical context, but I think you all pretty much touched on that question already. So thank you for that. I think the next question is just super important. What are the benefits to exploring controversial texts, and what can we learn from those? And Carolyn, will you start us off?
Sure. Well, certainly, since I worked in an academic institution, part of our goal in schools is to raise independent thinkers and students that are capable of asking good questions and that are future voters and informed participants in our democracy. And really, in order to be a well-informed voter, you need to understand multiple sides of a controversial issue. And especially when students are younger, that's partly how they form their own ideas. Of course, they have their family's environment that comes into play in them developing their own ideas, but they also read and think and learn from those encounters with books, whether it's fiction and they're encountering characters and developing empathy for a situation that they maybe have never thought about from that perspective before, or whether it's nonfiction and they're just learning more facts about the history of a particular law that has been enacted or a historical movement that they just didn't fully understand. I think it's fairly important that they have those encounters so that they're better informed. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll read a book and fall in love with the philosophy in it or agree with the choices a character made, nor do we expect that, but that they learn to use books almost as a counterpoint and say, well, I don't agree with that, or that does resonate with me. And that's sort of how we view it in education.
Thank you for that. Christina, you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I want to share a common saying that my mother always used to say to me growing up, and that was, whether I was fighting reading a book or going to church or whatever it might be, my mother would say, you don't truly know what you believe until you've explored other ways of believing. And what she was really referring to is what we do all day in the academic environment, and that's encourage critical inquiry. Exactly what Carolyn said. It's the process of gathering and evaluating information, ideas and assumptions, your own assumptions, or the assumptions that are a part of our particular cultures that we're in. And it allows you to produce a well-reasoned analysis and understanding of what it is you believe in, and hopefully articulate what others might believe in. And I truly believe that it does build, exploring different ideas builds empathy and compassion for ourselves as a humanity. And we know that our humanity worldwide is very diverse, and the ability to bring those different perspectives through inquiry and build empathy makes for a better world. But as Carolyn already said, it also makes for more informed voters when we're voting on policies that, or candidates who are going to have an impact on all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much for making that connection with voting. I really appreciate it. Okay, Spencer.
I would say there's a value in exploring them just to understand why they're controversial in the first place. Like we just talked about historical context, things are controversial at certain times with certain groups that aren't for other times and other groups. So just understanding an argument about why someone finds something controversial, you can't just take their word for it. You can, but you can also read what the actual text is and understand a little more about their point of view if they find it controversial. But also, as Carolyn said, you can develop your own point of view. We should always be developing and learning, working on ourselves and figuring out, well, do I agree with the person who thinks this book is, shouldn't be here? Or do I not like the book? Does it clash with my values? What are my values? As a community, what are our values? And sometimes, you don't know, like you said, until you come across something that isn't part of your values to even know if that's your value at all. and also, I think ideas are powerful. And that's the power of books, both fiction and nonfiction. And they're powerful in the way that they make you more open to the world all around you. So that people live that way, that people believe that thing, or that they don't believe that thing. The narrower your scope of your life, the less you're exposed to. And books are a great way to broaden that without having to, travel the world or do anything like that. And controversies are there because there are different values all over the world. So
I wanted to add, I think we forget sometimes that our founding fathers, if you even watch the musical Hamilton, you can see this, or read a biography about Benjamin Franklin, you can see that our founding fathers had a lot of conflicting ideas about what America should be and what the Constitution should be, and how we should move forward as a country. Should George Washington be a king or a president? So, and that discussion of ideas is part of the forming of our country. And as we change and grow, reading actually lets you get inside the heads of what people are thinking. There's no other way to get inside someone's experience, really, other than a film or a book, and really experience something from someone else's point of view, because we can't get inside of each other's heads. So authors allowing us to see inside of something really helps us gain a better understanding. And the last thing I wanted to mention was I used to coach Lincoln Douglas debate when I taught English in high school. And one of the things debaters are asked to do is prepare a case on the other side, on both sides. So they have to prepare equally strong cases on both sides of the issue. And I think it's a great thing for their independent thinking for students to be able to do that.
And I just want to jump in here too. And our conversation has kind of leaned toward subjects that are more on the cultural, social sciences side of the spectrum. But when we look at sciences and technology and mathematics, that's all about exploring new ideas and new theories. And that's what advances science and technology, so that we have the kind of medicine today and the internet and all of these things, because people were willing to read text and say, there might be a different approach, or there might be a different theory on this. And that's really critical to advancing who we are as societies in terms of science and math. And when you look at things like finding new technologies for climate change, that takes a lot of critical inquiry and thought.
Those are all such great reasons. Spencer, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just to tag one more thing on there. The really interesting thing about books in particular is nobody really forces you to open one. You don't have to go and read that book that's controversial. You can keep it shut. You can do that all you want. When you open it, if you're offended by something, that's a choice you've made, and your response is a choice. You can close the book, or you can dig deep and wrestle with yourself about why you were offended by that and answer that question. So I just want to bring that up. There's controversy exists because people choose to be offended by something that they didn't even have to look at. So just want to throw that out there.
I think that's an important skill to add on, that to teach kids is to learn to when to go, this isn't for me. And that's true of lots of things, not just a book, but being able to know themselves well enough to go, this item is not for me, or I'm not interested in it. And that you don't have to read something cover to cover. If you read the first 2 pages and you don't like it, it's voluntary. You can just pick something else.
I love it. Those were great answers. I so appreciate your insight. Well, it seems like we hear this word unprecedented a lot lately. And it appears that book challenging is on the rise. Is that what you're seeing, or is this something that is, historically accurate? Christina, you want to start?
So challenges, and as we've alluded to earlier, they've been around as long as information sources have been around, but most certainly we are seeing a significant increase, and I don't even know if significance is the right word, but from a local context, the Texas Tribune just put out an article yesterday saying that Texas has banned more books from school libraries than any other state. It's banned 108 books across 22 school districts and 174 titles. And that's at least twice as many as the year before. And I don't have statistics beyond that. Perhaps Carolyn has more within her advocacy work. But one other thing that we're seeing is the number of organized groups who are challenging these books. Previously was, as we talked about earlier, a patron who comes in and asks questions, and they want to learn more about the book and why it was put in the library. And it was a one-on-one conversation, but now these are organized groups. And what we've heard from our librarians from across the state is they are experiencing more challenges than they've ever experienced in careers that span 30, 40 years. And they're more stressed out than they've ever been in their entire careers. And unfortunately, to the point where many of them are either choosing to retire or leave librarianship altogether, and because it's just it really is an unprecedented level.
Spencer, what are you seeing?
In the last 2 years, I've had more conversations and challenges than the rest of my career combined. There are many reasons for that. I think it's been a very stressful couple of years, the last couple of years, and I think that's kind of done a lot of that. Kind of everything's heightened, right? I also think social media, as Christina was saying, with organizing groups. So we'll have someone comment on social media. We had a program and it was shared by the city on their social media, and then someone with a national following that didn't like our program shared it. And so our city social media just got thousands of comments, but those are from people all over the country and all over the world. So it's like a megaphone, but those people are distributed. They're not the majority, but it's really hard to separate that from everything else. And so people feel emboldened by that. They feel like everybody, well, first of all, nobody challenges a book thinking they're wrong, right? Everybody thinks that they're right. And so honest brokers will agree with them. That's how everybody feels about all their opinions, really, right? That, oh, if you only understood, you'd agree with me. And so I think seeing all these people from across the world give a thumbs up or a like on Twitter or whatever it is emboldens them in that belief. And so that comes into play there as well. So it used to be what all politics are local, but it's like all local politics are now global because of that. So I think those two things really come into play. Otherwise, I mean, how many school districts are there in Texas to connect them all with one book that's being challenged at that number of them? That's not an organic phenomenon. So I'm not to say that their opinions aren't valid. They truly hold all those opinions. It's just that they've, like we all do in social media, curated like an echo chamber to reinforce the validity of their opinion instead of question.
Thank you for that. Carolyn, what's your experience been?
I would definitely agree that we're at an unprecedented moment, and definitely agree that social media has had an impact on that, and that challenges we used to receive were from individuals. And in the course of the 29 years I was a librarian, we had 3 book challenges at the high school where I worked over 29 years. And schools this year and the last year have had 40 challenges. One school had 200 challenges. Another school district in our area had over 100 book challenges. So in 1 year. So, and in fact, in a month or two. And so you can see it's a completely different environment than we're accustomed to. And that's why we have policies and why policies are in place. But it does put a great deal of pressure on local authorities, either on school boards or city councils or library boards, because it does consume a great amount of manpower and man hours. And in schools, we're really understaffed right now because of, you know, a lot of people. There were quite a few retirements and departures during COVID, during the pandemic and post-pandemic. And so when you are already working with a staff limitation, and then you have quite a volume of book challenges, it creates a very stressful situation just from the workload, because what you want to be doing is spending your time on literacy, you know, because we're seeing that students' literacy scores are down, their math and science scores are down. And so we really want to get kids back up to speed and be reading. But when, you know, there's one most schools have one librarian or just an aide. So when that's the staff you have, and then you're spending a huge quantity of time reviewing your entire book collection or responding to, you know, a large number of book challenges, it really does create an unprecedented amount of stress, because you still got all the rest of your job to do, like teaching research and, you know, doing story time for classes that come in the library, and running the book fair and all the other things that are part of your job. And ALA and Pan America released some, you know, quantifying data about the number of challenges. ALA has documented 681 attempts book challenging this year nationwide. And I know that's vastly underreported, because just in local Texas schools, I know of myself, I know of over 200 book challenges that have been filed. So that's a third of that number just in my local area. So obviously that's grossly undercounted, but that's only through August. And last year there were over 700 book challenges nationwide that they documented for a whole year. So we're definitely going to exceed that number by a long shot. And so it's just a really challenging situation for schools and school districts. And, you know, we take serving our students very seriously. We take their education very seriously. And we want to be about the business of improving literacy and spending time with students and not on more administrative tasks.
Yeah, I think that's so important to point out the amount of time that gets taken to deal with that. I don't know if this is really a legal question or what your thoughts are on this, but I want to discuss censorship as a violation of the First Amendment. For example, our freedom to access information and express ideas, and upholding the right to read and learn. Spencer, can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we are a government institution. We cannot restrict, you know, but in my view, the First Amendment protects our residents from us restricting speech. That's why we have a robust collection development policy. That's why we don't have our opinions sway what we should and should not carry in the collection. There are books we have in our collection. We have over 200,000 items. There are books we have that I would shut down after 2 pages, because I'm like, it's not for me. I don't like it, but that doesn't matter. It's not about me. Anytime that you censor, and removing books from the collection is censoring. It's usually never in the favor of the people without power. Censorship is usually a majority-driven thing, or not even majority, but whoever has the power, cultural power, political power. That's who tries to shut down opposing voices, are the people who either have power or want power. Our job is to serve everyone regardless of what power they have. If the mayor wants something, we're going to treat him the same as we treat the homeless person that comes in and asks for services. And that's because we're treating the homeless person really well, not because we treat the mayor poorly, right? So if we go down the road of banning books, beyond challenging, banning books, who are we serving? We're not serving our public. 200,000 people, that's 200,000 opinions, right? No two people are exactly the same. And so every time we do that, I guarantee you, whatever we ban is going to impact those without power, impact those that are the most vulnerable. It might not immediately, right? The good intentions might last for a little while before the unintended consequences come on, but it's a double-edged sword every time. And once you go down that road, there's no easy place to cut it off. And there's never been, to my knowledge, a positive result that's come about from banning materials or speech or access to those things.
That is such a great point. Carolyn, share your thoughts on that.
I think schools are in a similar but different situation, but there is a famed Supreme Court ruling, Pico v. Island Trees, from the early 1980s, that says that materials cannot be removed from a school library just because the ideas within them are controversial, and recognizing the rights of students, the First Amendment rights of students, that they don't end at the schoolhouse door. There's other rulings that also have implications for students' freedom of speech and freedom of access as well. So definitely the court's intent in that ruling was to protect First Amendment rights. And that is sort of the place that librarians come from. And as I mentioned earlier, that policies protect all, I always think of it like we have books on everything from vegetarianism to, how to make barbecue. That's a wide range of opinions, right? Because vegetarians might not agree with making barbecue, but we're trying to have representation for all sorts of ideas. And librarians believe that students have those First Amendment rights, but not only do we believe it, the Supreme Court said that they did, and they've affirmed it in various kinds of cases about our students as well, and about schools. So it's important. And I totally support what Spencer mentioned a minute ago, that idea of power, whose voice is being elevated. And that's again, the reason we have policies, so that everybody's voice can be heard equally through following the school district's policy on library materials in the ways that is meant to protect due process for those materials.
Thank you. Christina, can you add to that?
Yeah. Bottom line, freedom to read is a human right. And in the United States, it's a constitutionally protected right by the First Amendment. And that means that individuals have the right to free inquiry, to explore their own opinions. And I won't add too much more, because I think what Spencer and Carolyn have said are spot on. But I do want to add one more Supreme Court case that supports this, and that's Texas versus Johnson. When Supreme Court Justice William Brenner Jr. said, and this is a quote, if there's a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it's that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds its idea offensive or disagreeable. And Spencer mentioned, they're a government agency, and many of our schools are we're public schools. I work in a public institution. And so in that sense, I am a government employee. Therefore, if I look at these cases that we've referenced here, we should not be censoring materials for that reason, because it would be violation of the First Amendment.
If I can add, I think it goes beyond, though, just a legal responsibility. Yeah, we have legal protections, but the United States also has a long and robust history of a culture of free expression that's even beyond that, to where we've constantly had pushback against the First Amendment from our founding, right? But the culture has overcome that time and time again, that it's more than just legally am I obligated to. This is a cultural norm, and in service of that, it's something that I think we should all support as institutions.
Great, thank you.
I'd like to add that, we're modeling for students what democracy looks like. So as we make these decisions in our institutions or in our schools or our other academic institutions, we have to remember that how we handle situations at times like this really are showing them a model. And we want to be sure that we're modeling how, as you said, the culture of free expression in the United States would dictate for us to model that, and so that we're representing democratic values, little d.
Very good. Okay, can we discuss circumstances when you might restrict access to printed materials rather than ban them altogether? Does this discourage freedom of thought? Does this action undermine one of the primary functions of education, which is teaching students how to think for themselves? And Caroline, will you start us off with that?
I think it's just very important that, as I've mentioned already, and so I don't have to add a lot more, but it's very important that we support students in becoming independent thinkers. It's really a skill, and I often think that sometimes we forget how global our workplace is right now, and that our students are not just necessarily going to be going out to work in our community. They may be working on Zoom like we are tonight, and working with people across not only across the country, but across the world. People whose ideas and backgrounds are very different from their own. And one of the things that workplaces look for is employees that can get along well with others, see other people's perspectives, be creative thinkers, and have diversity of ideas. And if we limit materials that students have access to in high school, then I feel like they are not as prepared to be part of the global marketplace, and they're not prepared to be part of a very diverse workplace that we have in our country right now.
Great, thank you. Christina.
One of the things that was mentioned earlier is that we have different school grades and libraries that are designed with collection development policies for those ages. And Spencer mentioned earlier that sometimes there might be challenges where maybe a book shouldn't be considered for teen, but should be considered for adult. And, I think those are reasonable ways of thinking about how materials are accessed. But in general, we need the ability to allow people to choose and think for themselves. And when they're youth, parents play a huge role in helping kids understand what might be appropriate. And it's important to speak to them about how they feel when they find a particular text, and think about that comfort level and make a choice for themselves.
Spencer, you want to share?
Yeah, I think, would we restrict access to printed materials versus moving it? That's a little different. So at our libraries, everything is self-checkout. So if a child is here and they grab a book that's in the adult section, they can check it out. The parent is responsible for that. We do rely on parents being parents. There are certain books I don't want my kids to read yet. And so I take responsibility for that. And that's a conversation I have with my children. I will say, though, that we don't collect pornography, right? So there are cases where, yeah, we've chosen to restrict access to the library materials of things that's also a Texas law, right? We can't legally, if we expose children to pornography, we've broken the law. So that is a pretty, extreme example, but it does show that there is a line somewhere. Now, who gets to judge what pornography is? The courts decide that, not us. So that's a good fallback for us to say, hey, it's not pornography. If you think it is, here's your avenue to make that case. But I think that we're very, very reluctant to do that, because even in the case of moving something that was in the teen area to an adult area, every teen is in a different place. Some teens are super emotionally and psychologically kind of aware of how things are and mature, and some teens are not. So what's appropriate for that kid is really dependent on the individual kid. And it's dependent on the parent and the family values. And that's where we can't act like that for everybody. And so that's why we're hesitant about moving. If there are things that are kind of egregious, again, where it falls under our policy that no, this shouldn't be here, it should be here, we'll move it. But that doesn't mean that there's no access to it. It means that it's up to the family and the individual to decide what they access. Barring, of course, legal blocks.
I wanted to add to what Spencer said, and I think that this is where in schools, it really comes down to that conversation, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, between the parent and their teacher, or the parent and the librarian, as to the guidelines they want for their own child. And that really ultimately is the best way to handle it, because it doesn't infringe on the rights of anyone else. And truly, we wouldn't tell someone else's child at the grocery store how to behave. At least most of the time we wouldn't, unless it was really egregious. And, so we each take responsibility for our own child and helping guide what we would prefer them to have access to. And so there's ways that school libraries can accommodate that, rather than restricting access to materials for all, because there's a certain level of, teens are easily embarrassed. All kids are easily embarrassed, and we don't want to put people in situations where they're embarrassed, or where they have an absent parent who didn't know they needed to sign a form because their parent's working 2 jobs and just doesn't have time to keep up with everything going on. And we don't want to put kids in embarrassing situations like that either. So that's another reason that it's really better if those conversations just can happen and it can be handled on an individual basis.
And I'd like to add that, unlike a school, no kid gets here without a parent. They can't get a library card without a parent. They can access this, they can walk up, but if they're under 12 and they're here by themselves, that's against our policy. By getting your child a library card, you've agreed to the responsibility of that part of parenting. So if they have that means they have access to this stuff, which means if you value certain things, you should have those conversations with your children about what your values are and why they are, and you should review what your child's checking out until they're old enough to, well, that's, teenagers, right? But you should have that option and be an active parent. And that's what we rely on, because we're not sweeping kids in off the street and handing them books without your parents knowing about it. So.
Oh, that is so great, because I had a question about age appropriateness and who ultimately is the arbiter of deciding what gets read. And I think you did a beautiful job of commenting on both of those issues. And I have so many more questions, but I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in respect for everyone's time. In celebrating the freedom to read during Banned Books Week, the American Library Association states that imposing information restraints on a free people is far more dangerous than any ideas that may be expressed in that information. And I'd just like you to share your thoughts on that, and we'll start with Christina.
Information, particularly in books, are a tool. It's a tool for understanding complex issues. And limiting people's access to books does not protect them from life's complex and challenging issues. It makes them ignorant to those complex issues of life. When we do that, they have less ability to think critically, and it is fundamental to a democracy to be able to think critically. It is what we need to do to be able to be informed voters on policies and issues and candidates that are a part of our community.
Thank you. Spencer.
I think if you think about all the regimes throughout history that ended up on the wrong side of things, they really like to restrict opposing viewpoints. And it goes back to power. People with power use this to restrict people who would criticize them, who would have arguments that oppose them. And I think that's where this is getting from, is on a free people, not individuals themselves, but on a society. Who restricts the information? It's going to be the people in power. And if the people in power restrict the information, they're going to restrict the information that challenges their power, right? And so you're going to just cement that, and people can't have free thought. They can't dissent. And ultimately, all of that is backed up with force and violence. If you look throughout history, if you look at, the former Soviet Union, any authoritarian group, they imprison people, they harm people, they murder people for ideas. And it starts with, it's all the same instinct. It's the instinct to silence people who disagree with you and to silence the ideas because they view the ideas as dangerous, where maybe the only thing it does is poses a danger to their status. That's probably hyperbolic in this conversation, but I think it's comes from the same seed. It's the same tree.
Yeah, that's really important. Carolyn, share your thoughts.
Well, I think I just want to add to both of those comments that a reminder that libraries are voluntary places of inquiry, and they're different from a classroom, which is still somewhat voluntary, but there is a curriculum, and parents can still in the classroom ask for a different curricular material if they are not comfortable with a certain book that's being read. But in a library, a typical elementary library might have 8,000 to 10,000 books. A typical high school library might have 20,000 books. So there's certainly a lot of choices there for people to engage with voluntarily. And again, I wanted to go back to what I said about our founding fathers and the beginnings of our democracy. People were hashing out from the beginning what this nation was and what was how we would operate and who was okay to have the vote in this country. And that's evolved over time, just like our culture has evolved. And sometimes when we get into these moments of information restriction, it's often a time period where there is a lot of growth and change, either globally or in our own country, that's making people feel discomfort and, requiring self-reflection, and also requiring compromise. And, we are a country built on compromise, honestly, from the very beginning. And so I think that trying to, again, have those conversations and find common ground is so important.
Okay, I want to bring this up just because this is so timely and topical before we get your closing thoughts. But the recent book challenges or objections that we're hearing about are centered on issues of race, sex, and sexuality, and they target books written by, for, and about people of color and the LGBTQ community, which to me effectively silences their stories and experiences. Why is it important for those stories to be readily available to interested readers? And we're going to start with Spencer.
I think this is a lot of what was mentioned before. It gains an understanding. It challenges your perceptions and your opinions and your values. And everyone should welcome having their values challenged, because it just makes you understand yourself more and why you should do it, right? They say steel sharpens steel, right? You're gonna learn more about yourself doing that. But also from our standpoint, we serve, again, 200,000 plus people. Collin County is over 1 million people now. I think there were, the last census, there were over 8,000 same-sex head of households in Collin County, if memory serves. Those people have spouses, children, coworkers, nieces, nephews, friends, family. And so it's not just that you're silencing the voice for that minority group, but everyone who knows that minority group, and their neighbors who maybe could either learn something about them or support them. So I think that it's just, it goes back to, we serve everybody. We don't serve everybody except the people that we disagree with. We serve everybody. And that's a principle for us, that we can't use our institutions to pick and choose who gets a seat at the table and whose voice gets heard. I'll also note that it's mostly been LGBTQ stuff for me, not very much race stuff challenged locally, but I did have global warming books challenged a lot. So it's not specifically only about that. I don't know if that answered the question well, but that's kind of where my stance is on.
No, thank you. I really respect the experiences that all of you have. Carolyn, you want to share your thoughts?
So I think, coming from my educator lens, from being a teacher, that we have great heart for kids, as do their families and their parents and their relatives. But one of the things that many teachers have is a great heart for vulnerable kids. And sometimes students of color who are feeling marginalized, or LGBTQ students, or students who are not LGBTQ, but perhaps their parents are, they sometimes feel spotlighted and vulnerable. And just as we would not want any student in our care to feel vulnerable, and we would want to do whatever we could for each parent's child to help them feel safe and protected in our schools, I think that having books on the shelf of a library sends a message to students that they're accepted, that their stories matter, and that their voice is part of the school ecology overall. And so I think no matter what reason someone may feel marginalized, maybe it's because they're vegetarian, or maybe it's because, they dyed their hair blue and no other kids in the school have blue hair, whatever reason it is. I think that just having materials available that send that message is really important for their their psyche. And again, bringing it back to families and parents and guardians, that if a family feels that there's something they don't want their child to encounter, then that's important to have that conversation with the teachers and librarians at their school so that we can act in the best interest of their personal family. But it's not a decision for all.
Thank you. Christina, please share.
Sure, and I'd like to tie this back into the previous question related to a free people. And it's important to recognize that in this country, not everyone was once free. And we had slavery, and Black people were not free. Women did not have the right to vote. And the LGBTQ community did not have the right to marry, among many, many other things. And so I think it's important that we recognize that we need to hear the stories and the experiences of people who have fought to bring more freedom as a free society into this country. It's important we hear their stories so that we understand the history and why it is what it is, and that we don't fall back into a society where we restrict the freedoms that we say we value as a culture.
Thank you so much.
I can quickly point out that
Yes.
none of those advancements in liberty would have happened without a protection of free speech. Suffragettes can't protest. People can't speak against slavery. Frederick Douglass can't write his book, famous books and talk about that stuff without the underlying free speech protections.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. Okay, we have blown through our time. I could sit here and talk for another hour, but I want to respect everybody else's time. So just some final thoughts. I wonder if you could each share what each of us can do to safeguard the freedom to read. And we're going to start with Carolyn.
There's so many things that community members can do to safeguard this freedom to read. And some examples are writing a letter to a local school board or to a public library board, just advocating for materials to be in that library and offering support. Writing to a librarian themselves and offering them moral support in these times is not necessarily a bad idea. Speaking at a school board meeting or a public library board meeting, writing a letter to the editor. Those are all things that people can do. You can invite librarians to come talk to a community group like the Rotary Club, if you're involved with the Rotary Club, or like you've invited us tonight, because sometimes there's just a lack of understanding and information. And the more we learn about different professions, the more we understand them and the more we can find places for dialogue. And that's important as well. There's a number of efforts going on, like ALA has a group called Unite Against Book Bans, which is a national coalition of people who care about the freedom to read. And that's just one group of many. In Texas, there's Texans for the Right to Read, which is a similar group just focused on Texas. And that's another group that it's worth connecting with if this is an issue that's important to you.
Thank you so much. Christina, share your final thoughts.
I'll echo all of that. I do think a great way to get involved is to join the coalitions locally, Texans for the Right to Read. Anybody can join. There's no cost, and it allows us to have more dialogue about what we're seeing and better understand why are we seeing censorship and how can we respond in a dialogue approach, right? Because we have to start talking across these different viewpoints and opinions. And then, so not to echo too much more, I do want to add a recurring theme from tonight that one thing you can do if you're a parent is talk to your kids about what they want to read. I think that's so critical. It really does come down to that individual family choice.
That's great advice. Okay, Spencer, you can take this conversation home.
Yeah, I would say on a personal level, what you can do is show grace to people who disagree with you and think about what level it would be where you would not want an item available, and then reflect on that and give them grace that they're coming at it as in good faith from just a different opinion, and having that conversation with your friends, with your family, with the librarians. If you don't think we should carry something, talk to us. Let's have an open conversation about it. I think that's the number one thing. Most people aren't inclined to challenge books. I saw in the question that there was a number it's a large number out of context, but there are 330 million Americans. So most Americans will never challenge a book. It just isn't going to happen. It's not a cultural norm for us, but that doesn't mean we should treat those who do with derision. We should work to understand them and understand their viewpoints and understand how we can serve them with grace and compassion, and realize that it's okay for us to disagree. But that doesn't mean that it's a win-loss situation.
That was such a great point. Before I wrap it up, anybody want to add anything else? I sure appreciate your time. All good? Okay, this concludes our program. I want to thank our panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules to join us. We are so grateful for the work that you do, and it's been such a pleasure to have you with us. To our audience, we hope you've gained some valuable insight or discovered some ways that you can share your support of the freedom to seek and to express ideas, even those some consider unorthodox or unpopular. We want to remind you that we have a very important election coming up. The deadline to register to vote is on October 11th. Early voting begins on October 24th and goes through November the 4th, and election day is November the 8th. We will have our recorded candidate forums on the website prior to the start of early voting, as well as our voter guides. Another great resource for information and a personalized ballot is vote411.org. Again, thank you so much to everyone for your interest in today's discussion and for being an informed voter. Thank you and good night.